United Nations important work in that area, one of its essential missions. And it's good to have you all here, despite all the weather barriers that have been put up in our way. A number of you indicated you're members of UNA-NCA. That's wonderful. We'd love to see you fully engaged in some of our programs. That we have just such a variety of activities that in the organization. There are many ways to become engaged. We have been focusing a lot recently on the United Nations Global Goals for Sustainable Development. This is probably one of the boldest actions taken by the UN since the UN Charter itself. And if the world community can get together and really focus on making progress on these global goals, I think we'll be living in a far different world. We'll leave a far different world for many of you young people here today than perhaps we've been able to achieve ourselves. And Steve Mosley, who made a few remarks a minute ago, and Ed Elmendorf are co-chairs of our task force on the Global Goals for Sustainable Development. And tonight's program, in a sense, is part of our effort to try to flesh out the meaning of Goal 16. So, and you'll hear more about that, I'm sure, as the evening progresses. But if you're interested in that, Steve and Ed can fill you in on that, and I urge you to talk to them about it. If you're not a member of UNA-NCA, join us. If you're a student under 22, it's free. It's a great opportunity, and it doesn't cost much even if you're a little older than that and not a student. And you'll get our UN Express with the many activities that we have, and you'll help support a program that's really critical today to increase public awareness and understanding of the United Nations and what it does. You know, there's a lot of ignorance and misinformation about the United Nations in this country, and we have a big job ahead of us in increasing public awareness of the activities of the UN and its values, both among our opinion leaders in Congress and in the press, but among citizens in general. And we do this in many ways. We start at a very early age. In middle and high school, we have our Global Classrooms program that reaches over 3,000 students in the area in DC public schools in Maryland and Virginia with a year-long curriculum. And then 600 of them come to the State Department each year for our Model UN, which is the largest outside event hosted by the State Department each year. And it's quite a thrilling experience, and if any of you'd like to get involved in that, there are opportunities to do so as advisors and moderators and so forth. And then we have a very strong young professionals group, a nice networking of people who are interested in international work, who get together and organize activities and help each other with career advancement and meet with more established, experienced people who can give guidance on career opportunities. And then we have dozens of programs each year on various subjects like you're going to hear tonight. So it's a good organization, and goodness knows the United Nations, you read about it in the paper every day. You know how actively engaged the UN is in humanitarian relief efforts. Unfortunately, we now have set a record in the most displaced and refugees around the world, and UN humanitarian efforts are struggling to keep up with the challenge. But at the same time, the UN is working in 16 different conflict zones. The UN peacekeepers are the largest military deployment in the world, and they operate at 1/8 the cost of U.S. boots on the ground, so they're a real cost-effective alternative to U.S. Involvement in many conflict zones around the world. And these conflict zones are the fragile states in which the threat of terrorism then grows and becomes a challenge for all of us. So the UN increasingly, as we look to this century, most of the challenges we face really do not respect sovereign borders, whether it's climate change or terrorism or health pandemics like the Ebola virus. No single country, not even one as powerful as the United States, can solve these problems alone. They require global cooperation. And the UN is the one institution with every state with a seat at the table. So it's never been more important to work through these international organizations. They're not perfect. We know they're not perfect. And as an organization, we constantly look for ways to ensure constructive U.S. leadership in making the UN more effective and more efficient in the work that it does. And U.S. leadership makes so much difference. I mean, there wouldn't be a UN without U.S. leadership. During Franklin Roosevelt and Harry Truman and Eleanor Roosevelt, without their vision, we wouldn't have a UN and the values that it embodies today. And I think it's even more important in this 21st century that we provide in the U.S., the support for the organization, and work to strengthen it and making it more effective in what it does. So that's the general sermon for tonight on the work that we do. I hope you'll join us if you're not already a member. If you are a member, I hope you'll find ways to be more actively engaged and involved in the work that we do. And so I want to thank the co-chairs that you've heard from Christina Hansen, and I'm now going to introduce Heather Hill, the co-chairs of our Human Rights Committee, among our most active committees in the organization. We just had a wonderful reception on Capitol Hill where we gave out Human Rights Awards. One of our awardees is present tonight, sitting right behind me. So it's a wonderful occasion to recognize the individuals that are really making a difference. I mean, there's so much bad news every day in the media and the press, and sometimes we don't recognize and realize how many people are working 24/7 to make this a more better and just world. And you'll find some of those individuals if you join our Human Rights Committee here at UNA-NCA. So without further ado, let me introduce Heather Hill to get the show on the road.
All right, well, good evening, everyone, and thank you all for making it out here in this amazing weather we're having. It's so nice and sunny. But really, we appreciate you coming out here for this event with us tonight. And Don and Alan, thank you both for your introductions here this morning and welcomes. It's the beginning of 2016, and we continue to celebrate the 70th anniversary of the UN. And I also think it's fairly safe to say that talking about human rights is something that happens every day, whether it is talking about how effective and how everyone is doing human rights or the lack thereof and how much we need to be doing in the human rights fields. I look at social media and I just see that as a high conversation these days, which is a great time for us to have an event like this. This is also the year of the new SDGs, and these global goals we have set to work towards and strive for over the next few years. As people in the U.S. right now, we also know it is the year in which the U.S. government is going to be sitting out of the Human Rights Council for its turn of holiday. So, so we gather here tonight to gain some perspective on the Human Rights Council's agenda for the year and to look at what the U.S. will be doing during its little working holiday, and what might happen this fall when the U.S. will be faced with two elections, that of the next U.S. president and returning seat on the HRC. Secretary General Ban Ki-moon stated towards the close of last year, "The world must invest more political energy in preventing and ending conflict and in addressing violations of human rights, our best early warning signs of greater trouble to follow." He also noted that far too many have fled violent extremists only to be victimized again by xenophobia, discrimination, and abuse. We must collectively challenge all those who stoke unfounded fears. Helping the vulnerable elevates us all. As we enter into our discussion tonight, it is our hope that each of us in this room engages in the conversation while earnestly thinking through not only what the UN's 2016 Human Rights Agenda is, not only the role that the U.S. should or should not continue to play on that scene, and how, but also what we as individuals and groups can be doing to promote peaceful and inclusive societies for sustainable development, and to provide access for justice for all, and build effective, accountable, and inclusive institutions. The reality of which would be amazing, and also is basically, in effect, the SDG 16. So before, I go on talking up here forever, I am going to go ahead and introduce Wes. He's our main speaker tonight, Dr. Wes Reisser, and he's currently serving at the State Department as the Senior Foreign Affairs Officer in the International Organization's Bureau's Office of Human Rights and Humanitarian Affairs. And as Don mentioned, Wes is also the recent recipient of our Tex Harris Award for Achievement of Human Rights through Diplomacy, and he's been a wonderful partner with UNA-NCA in our events. And he also has a Romanian dancing troupe, so a little piece of trivia for you. So after he speaks, I'll come and talk again and introduce our discussant. So, Wes?
Thanks so much, and good evening. And thank you, everybody, for coming out on a cold and icy night here. It's always a pleasure to be back with UNA-NCA. And I think this is, other than the awards night, the third or fourth event that I've done with the Human Rights Committee. I've been working on the Human Rights and Humanitarian Office in the Bureau of International Organizations at the State Department for over 5 years now. So I'm the longest man standing of our team that's been engaging at the Human Rights Council, although certainly not the sole member of it. But as we head into this particular year, I think it's a really interesting time to reflect back on what has been achieved. So the Human Rights Council, for those of you who aren't so familiar with the institution, was established in 2006 to replace the Commission on Human Rights at the United Nations, which had become a very moribund body. And at the time, the Bush administration was displeased with the way that the council was set up and also some of the membership of the council, and chose to not engage or run for a seat on the council. But when President Obama was elected, it was very quickly announced that the United States would seek a seat on the Human Rights Council. We actually took that seat in the summer of 2009, and because of the way the cycle changed, our 2 3-year terms actually ended up being 6.5 years instead of 6 years. And on January 1st, the United States took a mandatory year off the council, which I think a lot of folks are interpreting to mean that the U.S. will not be involved at the HRC over the next year. And I can assure you that nothing could be further from the truth. We have not even changed our staffing pattern with regards to the Human Rights Council. We're maintaining a separate ambassador in Geneva to the HRC. Our staffing in Geneva is the same, and our staffing in Washington will be the same over the next year. In effect, the U.S. being an observer rather than a member state of the HRC will pretty much have 2 major impacts on what it looks like for the U.S. over the next year. Number one, which will be the biggest, is that we don't have a vote anymore over the next year. And with that, we lose some of our negotiating leverage, although we are still allowed to participate in all of the negotiations on resolutions, and we indeed can still run resolutions at the HRC as an observer state. The other thing that will change is that our speaking time will be more abbreviated than it even was before. So in the Council's major agenda items, we will lose 1 minute off of what used to be 3. So we have 2 minutes to talk about every country's human rights record that we care about. We have 2 minutes to talk about gender. We have 2 minutes to talk about thematic human rights issues of concern, etc. And we also will speak later in the dialogues with the different procedures of the Council. But we will continue to engage and be out there with our voice and lobbying other countries that do have votes as well. On the voting side of things, the bigger changes for 2016 are not specific to the United States. I think if any one persistent problem is out there with the HRC, it is the membership. And that is something that we're doing everything that we can to encourage good countries to run, especially to contest slates against countries with poor human rights record. Although our ability to then ensure that that country wins a seat is incredibly limited, because all 193 UN members get to vote on who gets to be on the Human Rights Council. And many countries are willing to use other tactics to get elected to these bodies. Not specific to the HRC, but just this last year we saw the Egyptians handing out iPads the day of a UN election to delegations, which isn't going to change the US vote, but it might change the vote for a small delegation of 2 or 3 people that are pretty strapped, those kinds of things happening. And so there's a lot of shenanigans on the side that make it rough. And this particular year, I think the Council will have its worst makeup from the perspective of the US as far as our priorities since we joined in 2009. We have seen across the board in almost every region a degradation in membership of the Human Rights Council over the last year. For example, in the Latin American region, Venezuela was unfortunately re-elected to the Council, which was hugely disappointing to us, and Ecuador also won a seat. Brazil and Argentina have left. We're seeing a realignment among the Latin American seats more towards the Cuba, Venezuela axis of states, the ALBA states, than those that are more closely aligned with the U.S. on human rights priorities. In Africa, Burundi took a seat on the council right after a special session was held addressing the situation in Burundi. This is hugely embarrassing. We were not able to convince another African country to step up at the end and contest the election and keep Burundi off the council. And that is going to be a continuing challenge over the next 3 years for us. In the Asian region, Japan is taking a year off the council, and we're seeing more countries from the Asian group get elected who oppose the council addressing specific country situations. And so those are just a few examples, and I'd say even in Eastern Europe, we saw the country with the closest voting to the United States, Montenegro, have to step aside, and they've been replaced by Georgia, which is good on some issues, but is also pretty friendly with Iran, and that's going to be a big problem on some of the country-specific issues for us. And so the votes are going to be really tough this year, and I think in many ways this is going to be more of a defensive than an offensive year on the HRC. But we will continue to work very hard to hold the ground everywhere that we can, and also we are engaged in a very robust, long-term, not one-off effort to encourage good countries with strong credentials to run for the Human Rights Council. We want to be sure that the Council looks like the world. The Human Rights Council would lack all credibility if it was not a UN entity and it was housed through something like the Community of Democracies or some other forum of that nature. It has to look like the world, but we can still work to be sure that it is a variety of states that have improvements, not degradation in their situations that are being elected, states that listen to their civil society, encourage their civil society's participation in their process, much like we're going to do tonight. And through that, I think over time we can see some improvement. And if I look out over the next few years at countries that have declared their candidacies, I'm pretty convinced that this is going to be a low watermark for a while and that we should actually see a gradual improvement in the Council over the next few years. But sort of the last area that I want to cover during this time is what some of those priority areas will be for the U.S. during our year off the Council. Some of the key topics that we will be lobbying on, speaking about, working very hard to keep at the top of the Human Rights Council agenda. And then after our discussion, we can open it up to the floor and talk about the broader variety of issues and also go into some more detail about some of the ones that I talk about quickly. In general, I can lay out those priorities into sort of two key areas. We look at the actions taken at the UN on human rights through the lens of either country-specific situations or general thematic human rights issues. So on the thematic side first, this year, one of the very important special procedures of the Council, the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association, needs to be renewed. That's a resolution that's run by the United States. We created that mechanism after joining the Council, and it was the first new Special Rapporteur to look at a fundamental freedom in over a decade to be created at the HRC. And so the renewal of that mandate will be probably our #1 priority in the September Human Rights Council session. We're also very interested in taking further action on freedom of expression, which is, of course, an area that is very much under fire in many countries around the world. We're seeing a lot of further tightening of restrictions in places that were already quite restrictive, like Russia and China, but also other countries that are susceptible to the pressure of those states that are tightening up the noose on freedom of expression. So we want to take action there. Women's issues is always a priority area for the United States, and we hope to run a resolution this June on statelessness and women. Most of the people around the world who do not have a nationality are women and children, and we ran a resolution 3 years ago on this topic and want to follow that up with further action to draw attention to that. The Council will also run 2 other resolutions in June, one on violence against women, which is run by Canada. I think that resolution is going to be stronger on reproductive rights, and now that we have the Trudeau government in place in Canada, there was a lot of tension even between the United States and Canada on that particular issue over the last few years due to the differences with the conservative government there. But that's going to be always a very challenging issue where a large block of states are very much opposed to any mention of reproductive rights and also of sexual rights, which is an important priority area for the United States as well. You can't talk about reproductive rights without talking about sexual rights. We see the two areas as really overlapping. And that can be very controversial, especially for the OIC, so for the Islamic countries. In addition, we will be working very closely with our partners to try and get a new resolution through this year on the rights of LGBT persons. Our ultimate goal, I hope it happens now, but it may be another year or two off, will be to create either a special rapporteur or independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity at the HRC so that we can fully institutionalize that as we have been able to do with women, with religious minorities, and with other vulnerable groups of people before. Then there will be a lot of defensive areas which we can chat about later if we have time, but there will certainly be resolutions on counterterrorism and its relationship to human rights and many other areas as well where I expect there will be very contentious negotiations over the next year in Geneva. On the countryside, I will not cover all of them. There are too many to count, but for the US there will be several priority countries that we'll be addressing over the next year. The Iran Special Rapporteur is up for renewal in March, and following the recent conclusion of the nuclear agreement, I think this is going to be an incredibly difficult lift for us, and will be our probably #1 lobbying priority for the first session of the Human Rights Council this year. In addition to Iran, North Korea and Burma are on the docket for the March session of the Human Rights Council as well. Those two resolutions are run by the European Union. We'll be working very closely with them on those. There will be a slew of Israel-Palestinian related resolutions in March. And I think if anything will demonstrate the difference between the US being on and off the Council, those resolutions will probably pass without a vote, without the United States there taking a vote on the Israel-related resolutions. Then when we get to June, there will be resolutions on Belarus, Eritrea, and Ukraine. Ukraine was the first cooperative country resolution in the HRC's history to be voted. So that means a country comes to the Council and says, we want to address our problems with you. And Russia called a vote, and only 23 countries voted in favor. There were a lot of abstentions of the 47-member council as well, but I think that will be the toughest country in the June session for us. And in September, we will have Sudan. I should mention South Sudan as well in June, and then Sudan in September. And at every session this year, we expect there to be a resolution on Syria. The UN's Commission of Inquiry, which is the primary organ of the United Nations currently investigating the situation and reporting regularly on the situation in Syria, has to be renewed this March. It is now the longest running Commission of Inquiry at the HRC. Most of these things are a one-off. You create it, they investigate for anywhere from 6 months to a year, issue a report, and then stand down from their work. The Syria Commission of Inquiry, though, has been running steadily since August of 2011. And we believe it's essential to keep that mechanism in place because the Security Council will never be able to take meaningful action regarding the human rights situation and regarding war crimes taking place in Syria, because both Russia and China will, of course, veto any efforts to do that, as they did when we tried to refer the situation to the International Criminal Court. But the Commission of Inquiry really is important because they're able to collect the testimony of Syrians on the ground, create a record that can hopefully be used after the Syrian civil war for an accountability process. And so those are some of the key areas. I'm sure Ted will point out several more that I've forgotten. But I very much look forward to also taking your questions tonight and having a conversation about what U.S. involvement has looked like. Oh, and I do want to correct the record on one thing as well. There was a lot of press that the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights would be opening an office in Washington in 2016, and that is not happening. Unfortunately, the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly, which handles the UN budget, did not approve that in the budget. And so I'm hopeful that we will have a UN Human Rights Office operating here in Washington in the next couple of years, but it will not be in 2016, unfortunately.
Thank you. So hold your questions. We're going to come to them soon, but for now, I'm very pleased to introduce to you our discussant for the evening, Ted Piccone. He serves as a senior fellow in the Project on International Order and Strategy and Latin American Initiative in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution. And I hope that you all had the opportunity to read through his article, The 5 Myths on the UN Human Rights Council. It's a really great article. And we link to it on our blog, and I think that perhaps in a confirmation email you might have a link to that as well. But if not, check it out. And he too has been a great partner to UNA-NCA, and we're very thrilled to have him here tonight to discuss and then to engage in conversation with you all. So, Ted?
Great. Can you hear me? Now can you hear me? Okay, great. Well, good evening, and thanks for coming out, and thank you, Heather, for the introduction. I really liked your phrase, working holiday, because as you could hear from Wes's comments, it's definitely going to be a busy time for the United States, even though it's not a member of the Council. And I want to congratulate Wes again for the award he received, well-deserved. He, to me, is the epitome of a great professional who knows the substance and then knows how to get things done. That's a very special combination, and the good work that's been done over the last several years as the U.S. has been engaged with the Council is largely due to Wes and others working at the State Department in DRL and in I.O., and the really important leadership they've been providing in Geneva, and also an interesting innovation over the last several years, appointing an ambassador, a special ambassador to the Human Rights Council. It's now Keith Harper, who not only goes to Geneva, but also goes to key capitals and connects the dots to make sure that the messages are being transferred and disseminated and hopefully having impact as we try to build a more effective coalition of human rights friendly states who understand the importance that should be placed at the UN on these issues. It is the third pillar of the UN and often gets relegated to the side. I've been following these issues for several years now, and I've seen a progression of activity that overall is actually quite positive. And that's what I was trying to address in that article, because there are some old arguments that continue to be made about what's wrong with the body, and in fact, if you look at it in a dispassionate way, you'll find that there's more good than bad, and we can get into some of those details if you'd like. I think Wes already touched on one of the hardest topics, which is membership, and there are opportunities to address that issue. The U.S. has been, and other states need to be more involved in encouraging and recruiting states to run. It's all done by regional slates, and so when there's a clean slate, say the Africa group puts out 3 candidates for 3 seats, there's really no choice. So the key is to get competitive slates, so at least you could help states make those choices in the right way. And there's a pattern. We've seen a number of states lose a race or even withdraw because they knew they were going to lose. And those states include, Syria and Venezuela and Azerbaijan and Belarus and others. Now, unfortunately, Burundi, that really is, I think, a stain on this process. And you get into the politics and the trade-offs that go on at the UN that have nothing to do with human rights and their records, and that is one of the weaknesses of this process that needs to be addressed. But nonetheless, you work with what you get. And one of the values of the body looking like the UN is that when it does speak out and make decisions, it's representing the entire world body. And I think it ups the ante. A lot of countries are desperate to avoid that kind of reputational harm of having a resolution against them at the UN Human Rights Council. And so that's why this matters. States really do care about what happens in Geneva, and they go to the mat to block things from happening, and that's why the U.S. needs to be engaged and leading foot forward, and I think that's what this period of time of U.S. membership on the Council has proven, that the Council's output, its impact, its visibility, its seriousness has really improved over the last several years. Let me switch now to some of the priorities that Wes mentioned, none of which I can really argue against. We've seen the importance of special rapporteurs who are independent experts. They work on a pro bono basis, and they travel around the world and make country visits, and they look into and monitor what's going on in particular countries, and they play a very important role. I wrote a book on the subject, if you're interested, that looks at the national level impact that these independent experts make. And by showing up in a country with the UN flag, they get attention, they get the key meetings they need to get, they give a voice to victims and to NGOs, and then they can bring those findings back to the UN, both in Geneva, and oftentimes they report to New York as well. And that's what gives the visibility on these issues that matter. And I've seen and I've documented a number of cases where their reports and interventions have made a difference. So it's a good goal to have, for example, in the LGBT case, to have an independent expert appointed on that issue. In terms of the country-specific matters, we're issuing a paper in the next several weeks that really goes into some detail documenting the scope of country-specific activity at the Council. It's not just the resolutions that Wes mentioned. There are a whole range of activities that go into detail into a country's behavior against international human rights norms. It's happening through the resolutions, it's happening through the country visits of special rapporteurs and commissions of inquiry. But it's also happening through the Universal Periodic Review, which is one of the new mechanisms that was created under the new council, and gives a chance for every country in the world to be monitored and scrutinized, to present their human rights record, and to have it debated and critiqued. And then the states agree or don't agree to adopt a certain number of recommendations that are made in the process, and that becomes a benchmark to then hold them accountable to those recommendations that they have accepted. And by doing this within a universal context, and not just the United States or Europe or other countries pointing a finger at them and saying, you need to do this. No, it's the UN body that has said you need to do this, and you've accepted these recommendations. It totally changes the conversation. And it also gives civil society a much greater voice in the process, both in the input process and in the monitoring process. So that's another way that country-specific activity happens. There's also, of course, the treaty bodies and their regular country reporting process. And all of these provide a really rich catalog of the various priorities and challenges around the world, including, I have to say, for the United States. I mean, we have to be ourselves more willing to practice what we preach. And if we want to be a leader in this field, then we need to be honest about our own shortcomings and to hold ourselves accountable to the universal norms that we're trumpeting, but often falling behind in terms of implementation. And I think this administration has paid some attention to that through the Universal Periodic Review, but always more can be done on that front. Let me mention just two other quick points. One is the question of Israel, which often gets a tremendous amount of attention here in Washington and on Capitol Hill. There's no question, in my view, that by having a permanent item just devoted to Israel-Palestine on the Human Rights Council agenda is unfair. It's a biased approach to Israel and needs to be addressed. There are various mechanisms already in place to monitor the human rights situation in that part of the world. It would be helpful if that whole process was less politicized and more, engaging all the various parties, including Israel, in the process. often Israel, because of this bias, says we're not going to cooperate with this mechanism, and you don't really get the outcome that you'd like. Now, if I recall, the Congress did pass language in the Omnibus Appropriations Bill that requires the Secretary of State to certify that the Human Rights Council is addressing this problem of bias, and that our membership is in our national interest. And that'll be, I think, an ongoing challenge for the administration. It means that the Israel problem will remain a high priority for us, given the congressional concern. And then finally, on resources, you know, human rights, all these years at the UN, we've been doing on the cheap. It's really a kind of a sad statement of our priorities. Only 3% of the UN's regular budget goes to human rights pillar. It's an embarrassing figure. And as you just heard, the 5th committee in New York, which handles the budget, is often the one stepping in and cutting these budgets even. But you can't fund these kinds of mechanisms and country visits and whatnot without proper resources. And so this group, I think, could be an important voice for not only U.S. leadership, but U.S. Resources that need to go behind these mechanisms. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. Do you want to take a moment and respond at all to anything, or otherwise I'll open to questions now?
I guess I would just really quickly note, for as far as practicing what we preach, I think that's really important, and I want to thank Ted for pointing that out. I would note, one, the U.S. UPR was last year, our second UPR, and we accepted 228 recommendations in total. The United States received the most recommendations in both the first and the second cycle of the UPR. But one thing that we do with the UPR is we actually have a policy to make recommendations to every single country. So all 192 other UN members, when their UPR comes up, we make recommendations to them. Now, with certain countries, there are way more recommendations than we would like to make than we can. And so we limit ourselves to 3 for each country. But we even make recommendations to Monaco when they have their UPR, or the Seychelles when they have their UPR. So it isn't, for the U.S., something that we treat selectively. When you look at who receives the recommendations that the U.S. and Sweden have received the most, does show, I think, one of the problems there, in that certain countries don't treat the UPR in such a non-selective manner, but it's a really important mechanism. And for us, it's very challenging sitting over in the State Department, because, of course, the implementation of U.S. recommendations lays almost exclusively outside of the State Department and within the other various branches of the federal government. And many of the recommendations that we do not accept as the United States are because we can't accept them. They're recommendations that a unitary state can accept, but that a federal state can't accept, because the U.S. federal government cannot take obligations on board that would solely impact the states and not impact federal policy. But one thing I think is very important for American civil society, of course, is to be able to then take those recommendations, which the State Department didn't make on their own. All of those acceptances were coordinated through the White House and the NSC with all of the various agencies that actually have responsibility. And civil society can hold those up to the EPA, the Justice Department, HHS, whatever the implementing agency is, and use that as a means to pressure the U.S. to live up to our commitments and our obligations. And I think that's really important. And the other thing I would note is on the country visit side, the U.S. received a visit late last year from the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women. I think their final report was incredibly unfair towards the United States. They portrayed us as having one of the worst situations of gender equality in the world, at least that was the headline. But we allow in mechanisms, whether we agree with what they're going to say to us or not. The Working Group on Peoples of African Descent is in the United States right now. They started in Washington, D.C. They also met with the mayor of Baltimore to talk about the situation over the last year there. While they were here in D.C., the Conference of Mayors was here at the same time. They then went down to Mississippi, to Illinois, where they are now, I believe, and then they will have their final stop in New York. And in some of these states, they're meeting with the mayors of major American cities. They're meeting with the chiefs of police. They're meeting with the attorney generals of some of these states. And I think that that's really important that these groups come in. And I'm sure they're going to say some things that we're not going to like. But any of us who are paying attention to what's happening in our country right now are quite aware that people of African descent in the United States continue to face undue challenges and burdens that we have not repaired from our history. And so I think this visit in that regard is incredibly important. But we do allow in those mechanisms even if they're a mechanism that we voted against. So we receive visit requests from special rapporteurs of the Human Rights Council that we oppose in principle, and we still will allow them to visit. The way the rules work is each country can only take 2 a year because that's how much the UN funds, is 2 visits per special rapporteur, and so the UN asks that no country takes more than 2 a year. Sometimes we'll get 3 one year and then 1 the next. But that way we can ensure that every mechanism doesn't only visit the US, because I promise you they all ask to see us first, but that we lead by example, and that we do that by facilitating these visits. And so I think that's another important way in which we engage domestically with these mechanisms. And the one last thing I forgot to mention, of course, although you alluded to it at the beginning, was yes, the US is taking its year off, but we actually will be up for re-election to the Human Rights Council the first week of November, which is a busy week here. All across the United States, not just in Washington, although we pay the most attention here, I think, to that. So that election, though, this time for the Western European and Others group, which is our regional group at the UN, is a clean slate. So the United States and the United Kingdom are the only 2 running. I have no problem with contested slates in the Western European and Others group because I'm not going to lose an election. But at least I can say on the positive side, I can't think of a single member of that particular group that would be a problematic country to have on the council. My biggest concern with our region is that it's not all EU, that we have a mixture of members of the European Union and others, because the others include Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in our group, as well as several European countries outside the EU. And it's important to have that diversity of voice. And so that's something we look for. But that election is coming up, and we will be releasing, and hopefully publicly in the next month or so, our pledges and commitments for our next term on the Human Rights Council. They'll look a little bit vague, but that's mostly because I can't promise anything before I even know who the next president of the United States is going to be. But I think that we can, in general, make a lot of commitments to the areas of focus that will be important for the United States during our next 3 years on the Council, and the different commitments that we are willing to make to the UN and to the human rights institutions at the UN as a part of our candidacy.
Great, thank you. Anything? All right. So this is the part of the conversation where you all get to join in, and we have a microphone that will be passed around. When you have a question, if you would just stand, share your name and your affiliation, and try and keep your comment to about 2 minutes, and we'll take 2 questions at a time and then respond and then come back for more. How does that sound? Who goes first? Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Bardwell, attorney. Anyone who would like to answer this. We've talked about existing norms that the United States has perhaps not lived up to, for example, in the racial area. But are there any presently emerging norms that perhaps we object to? Anything that other countries are starting to do that we just don't think should be done?
I would say there's a whole host of areas that are being introduced into the human rights system, some that we might fundamentally disagree with because we don't think they have a basis in international law. There's a second batch of sort of new ideas that are being pushed before the council that I think are being pushed to distract and to keep the council from engaging on its key mission. If you see a resolution running where Cuba is the lead sponsor, it probably falls into the latter category. Their latest obsession is on the rights of peasants. And I'm not sure why we need to look at that as a separate category. And that's one that's very problematic for us from a legal perspective, although I don't know in the United States domestically what would constitute a peasant. So that's one example. Cuba and friends have also been pushing a series of resolutions and the creation of a mandate on unilateral coercive measures, which is their term for sanctions. And they are claiming that the imposition of sanctions on another country is a violation of human rights. And of course, we fundamentally disagree with that. We believe that it is certainly within our sovereign rights as a state to impose sanctions, including, of course, for human rights violations and abuses, like we can do through the Magnitsky Act. Towards the Russians, we have separate human rights sanctions in place on named individuals and entities in Iran, in Cuba, etc. And so that's another really problematic area where we fundamentally disagree. The last one that I would mention, and this is the most legalistic and one where some U.S. friends, I would say, are not on the same side as we are, is on a so-called right to peace as a human rights issue. And of course, the maintenance of international peace and security is one of the foremost aims of the United Nations as an institution. But we don't see that particular issue as being primarily a human rights issue. There are many human rights issues. I don't want to downplay that there are many human rights issues that are intimately linked with the failure of international peace and security, right? Be that violence against women, selective attacks on vulnerable groups of people, mistreatment of refugees and internally displaced persons, etc. But this really is trying to take one body of international law that applies to the law of war, international humanitarian law, and redefine it under international human rights law, which is a problem area for us. And so that's a few examples. The last one I would give is there are a group of countries that are trying to redefine how human rights applies to terrorism and counterterrorism. We believe very much that that you must focus on the actions of states, because human rights law does not apply to non-state actors. It only applies to states. And so when you talk about human rights and counterterrorism, you have to look at how states can counter terrorism while at the same time protecting human rights. There are a group of states that would like to redefine that, and they're led by Egypt, to redefine that to say that terrorists are the ultimate violator of human rights, and therefore states can take any action that they deem necessary to counter terrorism. Which of course justifies then egregious violations of human rights against anyone who is a would-be terrorist, which will lead to the recruitment of more terrorists and probably actually exacerbate the situation. So not only is it problematic from a legal perspective, but it is also problematic in that in practice it will be counterproductive. So that's just a few examples. There are many others that I could probably choose. I don't know, Ted, if there's any from your perspective.
Yeah, this is a great question. I would just add one more, which has been difficult for the United States and I think for other states, which is the so-called right to development, which is also a Cuban-led, but also many African states feel strongly about this issue. And when you come down to it, it really is a way for them to solidify a reallocation of resources from the north to the south. And there's even talk about turning that into a treaty someday. And we've always opposed that notion, and understandably so. At the same time, there are other rights in the economic and social and cultural rights sphere that we have traditionally also opposed. And I think we're beginning to rethink some of those for many other countries around the world that we need as partners. When they think human rights, they think about the right to housing, the right to health, the right to education, the right to clean water. These are things we take for granted, but they are not constitutional rights under our system. So our response is we don't recognize them, and we have not ratified that treaty on economic and social rights. My argument has been that we have got to reconsider that approach, and that we increasingly do talk about, for example, the right to health as a right, We certainly have adopted language in the UN Declaration, certainly the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that talks about the right to education. That seems pretty much a standard kind of good thing that we all believe in and should not be controversial for us. So sometimes the lawyers, and I'm a lawyer so I can say this, overtake this debate, and we get in the way of building a constituency for human rights that is a win-win for North and South, and a way to deflect this idea of right to development, which we don't want to buy into.
Another
Is that
question?
fair, Wes? Is that
That's
fair?
absolutely fair. I mean, we certainly have taken a more progressive stance than under any previous administration on these economic, social, and cultural rights, but that does have its limit for us, both because they are not enumerated in our own Constitution, and the Senate has declined so far to ratify the convention, although it was signed during the Carter administration. But also, I would say that we see those kind of, there's a whole range of economic, social, and cultural rights issues that are being addressed at the UN, some of which, like right to education, are easier for us, and others which really step into realms that are tough for our lawyers. I'm a PhD geographer, so I only understand that at a more cursory level than the lawyers do. But there certainly is a gradation there. The right to development, though, is certainly the one where we hold the most firm red line as far as its inclusion. There are some of the most absurd proposals that come out from certain countries, and it really is certain countries in Africa and India that sort of lead the charge on this particular one. But our problem with it is twofold. The one is the reallocation of resources, saying that states in the North are legally mandated to provide development assistance, essentially, which we provide enormous amounts of development assistance, but we don't do it because we have a legal obligation to do it. We do it because it's the right thing. And the other issue that we find is that some states will use the right to development as an excuse to not implement the fundamental human rights. That you can use the excuse of underdevelopment to say we don't need freedom of expression, we don't need freedom of religion, we don't need freedom of assembly, of association, because we aren't fully developed yet. And we fundamentally disagree that development is a precursor to the embrace of human rights, that you can embrace those from the start and develop while respecting them instead.
One final thought on this, which is one other way to address that argument is to focus on Goal 16 of the Sustainable Development Goals and talk about the right way in which development should be discussed and the appropriate mechanisms and accountability and transparency and citizen participation, and really push that issue as a counter move.
Brilliant. Another question. Ed? And then we'll come back to you right there. Take two at the same time.
Thanks very much. I'm Ed Elmendorf from the UNA-NCA Human Rights Committee. The discussion thus far has focused very much on the intergovernmental side of the UN, and particularly on the U.S. government. I'd like to turn the focus a little bit away from that towards the UN itself, and particularly to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. And I would be interested in hearing from both Wes and Ted about how they see the evolution of that office, the influence of the High Commissioner for the first time an Arab. How is that working? What is the impact within the UN? And how do you see the future? Thank you.
The second one.
Can we take, yes, her there.
Thank you. Actually, my question kind of aligns. I'm Oriana. I'm a student here at the George Washington University. And my question is, how much does the pressure from civil society, from students, or from the citizens of the world in general, how much does that pressure actually turn into action? From your explanation, it seems that there's so much politics and bureaucracy behind the membership and the actions of resolutions that go into the Human Rights Council. So, what is the the population of the world to do when there are problems that we need to confront. Thank you.
Maybe we'll take the second question first. I can point you to the essay out front that I wrote for the Human Rights Awards last year, which I wanted to focus a little bit about the importance of engagement between civil society and government in the promotion and protection of human rights, and that I think is important both domestically and, of course, internationally as well. And my partnership with UNA-NCA, I think, is partly because not only do I personally, but the State Department believes very much that it is essential for us to not just go in with our own internal discussion only, talking about the issues that matter to us, but to engage in a dialogue with American civil society that is interested in the rest of the world, to hear from them about the issues that matter to them, and to address those where and how we can. And I do want to caveat that because, of course, everything that we do at the Human Rights Council is part of our broader foreign policy. And so there are certain countries that have very concerning human rights records that for other reasons, other foreign policy reasons, I'll let you guess yourself which ones some of those are, we can't address in the same way at the United Nations as others. But I still want to hear from civil society about what they think about the situation in those countries and hear from them about their ideas of what to do. But civil society shouldn't only play that role in its advocacy towards the United States alone, but towards the other members of the body. I'll give you one really good example. In 2011, South Africa ended up running the first ever resolution at the UN on LGBT rights to be adopted. Their resolution didn't start out as a resolution for LGBT rights. It started out as a resolution that would have created an intergovernmental process to decide whether LGBT people were protected under international human rights law or not. And you can imagine how those discussions would have gone with countries like Pakistan and Russia and Nigeria and Egypt taking advantage of a situation like that to make sure that there never was any sort of international consensus on the issue. We worked with American LGBT civil society groups who called their friends in South Africa, who went and protested in front of the South African Ministry of Foreign Affairs every day, demanding a meeting with the foreign minister. After a week, they got in, and 2 days later, the resolution was pulled and a new resolution was tabled, which is the one that the Human Rights Council adopted. I think that's an amazing example of where civil society was able to push a government that was going to do something wrong to do the right thing. And not every country will be responsive to that, but most every democracy is going to be responsive to its own citizens when pressed in that kind of way. And so American civil society both can play a role in telling us what you want your government to be talking about to help us prioritize issues that we take before the UN, but also then to work with civil society in other countries to make sure that those governments are doing the right thing and pushing on the right issues, and also working with the various civil society organizations that have been accredited to the UN to be sure that they're raising those issues during their allotted speaking time at the Human Rights Council. The Human Rights Council is an unusual UN body in that NGOs get to speak in all of the debates, not just states. And also, those folks can put on side events, which can help educate the diplomats at the Human Rights Council to different issues and situations around the world, and that's really, really important. Especially, I think, for the US, we have a big bureaucracy, we have a ton of civil society. We're aware of most, but not all of the important human rights issues that are taking place around the world. Now imagine if you were from the delegation of a small country like Mongolia, which has just joined the Human Rights Council this year. There's less than 3 million people in your whole country. You have less than 25 embassies in the entire world. So you're not on the ground everywhere yourself watching these things. But your diplomats in Geneva can go and hear directly from the victims themselves. I sat in a side event this summer and listened to 2 Yazidi girls who had been kidnapped by ISIS, raped, sold around many times, tell their stories to the world. And that was powerful for me to hear, but it was especially powerful for those states that are not doing the right thing regarding the situation in Iraq and Syria and the human rights situation there, to hear that and to be able to then push back on their own governments to change their position and to take a different position at the UN on those issues. So that's how I can see it going with the civil society side. I don't know if you want to add there, and then we can take the second question.
Sure, yeah. I mean, the civil society angle is the reason I'm here, because before I went to Brookings, I was running a project that was precisely designed to try to mobilize and stimulate greater civil society attention to what's happening at the UN more generally on democracy and human rights issues. And what we found was a huge deficit, a huge gap in the knowledge of how the mechanisms work, how the UN human rights system works, and the resources to actually mobilize and get engaged. And so we began targeting a few key countries and helping them get to Geneva. And now, several years later, you see, of course, not only the traditional Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, etc., at Geneva, because it is a specialized activity, and you do need experts who are engaged. But you have representatives from NGOs in Africa, from Brazil, from Argentina, from Chile, from Southeast Asia, all with representatives full-time, engaged in all the lobbying that has to happen in the halls of the Palais des Nations. So I think that's been a great change and improvement. More can be done for sure. But it's also helping enlighten folks back in capitals about how states are actually voting. So when a state votes or they hear the position of a delegation as X, they are able to mobilize public opinion back home and put pressure on their governments to change their votes. And we've seen that happen in a number of cases, including in Brazil, where they not only got attention to this, but they brought activists from Iran to Brazil and have them meet with the foreign ministry, have them do media interviews, etc. And Brazil changed its vote on the Iran resolution as a result. So this is a pretty encouraging development. One downside on this part of the system is that, Wes mentioned, you need to really be engaged, you need to have accreditation. And to get accreditation, you need to go to the UNHRC committee, which is a terrible committee, which is known to harass NGOs with endless appeals for information over and over and over again. And my group, before I got to Brookings, we were a victim of this, and I know many others have been. It's a problem that really could be fixed and should be fixed with some leadership. It tends to be kind of marginalized over there. It's a pain, but people don't really put the capital into it, but it is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Although I would note, interestingly, earlier this week, an Israeli NGO was accredited by consensus, and Iran and Pakistan are members of the NGO committee and chose to let an Israeli group through. So I take that as a hopeful start to the new NGO committee session, but I'm not holding my breath that it's going to last for very long. So Ed, to your question, as far as how we see the High Commissioner's office changing with the both in light of the appointment of the new High Commissioner for Human Rights, Prince Said of Jordan, who was previously Jordan's representative to the UN in New York, and prior to that, their ambassador to Washington, actually. And just more generally, I mean, I would say, as far as specific to the person, the United States, at least as a government, is incredibly pleased with the change over. We think that he is a much more forceful voice on a lot of important issues than his predecessor was in the role. He also understands the UN system and how to move the UN system better than many other high commissioners have before, and I think that's partly because he had served on the other side of the table as an ambassador of a member state to the UN beforehand, and so he understands the political side of the process, and he knows the players in New York very well, even though he sits in Geneva. But I think he's been an incredibly powerful voice. I've been especially encouraged to see him be very vocal on issues where we weren't sure that an Arab man would necessarily be particularly vocal. On women's issues, on LGBT issues, he's certainly been far more outspoken than we thought he might end up being. And also on human rights situations taking place in the Middle East, he has sometimes spoken out, taking positions that are contrary to that of his own country, Jordan, especially in the situation in Yemen. He's been far more outspoken about the situation on the ground in Yemen than his former government would probably like to see him be. as one good example. So I would say in general, we're pretty pleased with him. The office as a whole, I think, does incredibly important and really good work. There are some staffing problems, as always. I think for the U.S., our biggest complaint would be that we think that Americans are incredibly underrepresented. We're less than 2% of the staff at the Office of the High Commissioner, and we are entitled, as the largest funder to the UN, to be somewhere around 15 to 20% of the staff. Partly, I think it's not enough Americans apply for these jobs, but also there's a pretty anti-American bias within the UN bureaucracy in Geneva, especially, and it's a tough place to work as an American. But the High Commissioner's Office, I think, is doing a lot of really important and quality work in many key areas, and the proliferation of issues over the last few years from what they had to do 10 years ago has been incredibly challenging for the office, and I think they've really risen to the occasion. The sheer number of mandates that have come out of the Human Rights Council over that period of time have ballooned massively, and the number of crisis situations where the High Commissioner's Office is having to respond not with 1 or 2 additional staff, but significant numbers of additional people, I think has been very impressive. One example that I would plug where I think they're doing absolutely incredible work on the ground is in Ukraine, another country like Syria, where the Russians are blocking, of course, any action in the UN Security Council. And the High Commissioner has a huge human rights monitoring mission in Ukraine. They have people on the ground all over the country, and they are reporting on everywhere, including the areas that they're not on the ground in the areas under Russian occupation, but they're interviewing people in those areas and reporting on the situation in those places. And I think that that's absolutely essential. So that's just one of, I think, many examples I could come up with of some of the excellent work we're seeing right now.
So I would just add a couple points. I agree with almost everything Wes said. The OHCHR has ramped up its office in New York so that you now have an Assistant Secretary General responsible for human rights. And he is able to, be in the right place at the right time to help bring the work of Geneva to New York, to mainstream human rights issues. You've seen a big increase in the number of appearances, presentations by the High Commissioner, and this started before Zaid, to the Security Council. And that's very important. There's really now, there used to be standard protocol objection to any attempt to bring human rights onto the Security Council agenda, with states saying this has nothing to do with international peace and security. That is changing, and I just heard recently the last briefing that the Assistant Secretary General did to the Security Council was on Burundi and received absolutely no procedural objection. Because increasingly people understand that these are all interdependent issues, that if you have a problem of conflict on the ground, it has something to do with human rights, and you need to have the human rights experts come before. One other example in that regard that's quite encouraging is in North Korea, where you have the Human Rights Council commissioning a commission of inquiry on North Korea. A very hard-hitting independent report came out. That report made its way to New York and now was presented to the Security Council, and now there's an item on the agenda of the Security Council regarding not just North Korea, but human rights in North Korea, and with the potential of a referral to the International Criminal Court. This didn't happen before. This is a very positive change. So more connectivity between Geneva and New York, and accountability.
What about the money?
For OHCHR?
Yeah. I mean, so we count the number a little bit different than 3%. We think that the number is a little bit higher because when you also take into account the large number of human rights observers that are now in all but 3 of the peacekeeping missions, that pushes up the number a little bit, but that still doesn't get us above 5 or 6%. I think there's sort of a twofold issue there. One, the total demands being placed upon the United Nations today are greater than at any time, at the same time that many governments are facing very austere budget conditions at home. And so really the only way to be able to increase the OHCHR's budget would be to slash the budgets of other parts of the UN system. we are not going to be able to get the UN realistically right now to agree to raising the rates on countries, at least until the global economy is in a different place than it is now. And as you know, here in Washington, trying to make a sale to Congress to increase the U.S. regular contribution to the UN, just to get us funded fully, is an incredible fight. And being able to grow that, I think, will be an enormous challenge. But one of the important things that can be done, and I think that the United States does very well, that we try to lead by example on, is on voluntary contributions as well. And so OHCHR, as well as many other UN entities that work on human rights issues, so UN Women would be another really good example, that increasing voluntary contributions, I think, are also essential to the ongoing operation of those particular entities. OHCHR, a lot of its country-specific missions that are the consensual ones, so the Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, the country offices in Honduras, El Salvador, and Yemen, etc., those are all funded entirely by voluntary contributions from UN member states. And I would love for Congress to give us more money to be able to voluntarily contribute to OHCHR to do that important work. And of course, we also need the help of civil society and other countries that can be donors to be pressing their governments to allocate money, as well as on the voluntary side of the house to do some of that work. I think realistically, in the short to medium term, that is the best way that we can increase their resourcing. Because more mandatory contributions to the UN, I think just politically in the United States and in the European Union and in Japan and in China, the major funding countries of the UN, is a fight that probably isn't going to be won right now.
Yes, please. We'll take the last two questions. So, in the back and then here in the green shirt.
Moyo, I was just wondering, are you seeing efforts to mainstream human rights within the specialized agencies of the United Nations? And I'm thinking specifically of the right to food, for instance. Are we seeing that norm sort of being turned into something usable within the WTO when it comes to agricultural agreements? Thank you.
And then over here on the side of the room.
Hi, my name is Kate. You mentioned that one of the difficulties on the Human Rights Council is getting countries in there that have relatively good human rights records. Why is it that those countries don't want to, I guess, run for a seat? And is there any way that, any mechanism that could address that problem?
So to the first question, I don't work on the World Trade Organization, so I actually don't really have any insight into that. I would say in general, the mainstreaming of human rights into the work of broader UN entities is very much happening. One of OHCHR's big agenda items, which has also become one of the main agenda items for the Secretary General, is the Human Rights First agenda, which is really to mainstream human rights into the work of everywhere at the UN. However, I would say from the perspective of the United States, we wouldn't be prioritizing some of the rights areas that we have concerns about whether or not they are real. And I think the right to food is a really challenging one for the United States in that regard. But we are very cognizant and very supportive of the UN's efforts to educate everybody who's working in the other various parts of the UN to human rights issues, to ensure that UN entities are engaging. And we have dialogues now on this in a whole variety of areas with many of the UN specialized agencies. The thematic area I work in the most closely is LGBT rights. And in that regard, we've worked very closely with the Secretariat to be sure that the UN isn't engaging in discriminatory practices as far as its not just hiring, but also as far as its provision of benefits to LGBT people, to be sure that folks who are in a same-sex marriage get the same marriage benefits as a heterosexual couple would get, The UN used to only do that if the country had same-sex marriage itself of the citizenship of the country. So an Egyptian could come to New York, get a job at the UN, get married in New York legally, but because he was a citizen of Egypt, would not have been able to give health insurance and life insurance to their spouse. So we fought and worked very hard in the Secretariat on some of those issues. But also, the Human Rights First effort really extends to all of the specialized and technical agencies of the UN to ensure that all UN staff are educated into the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and are applying its precepts within their work. And that agenda item, I think, is essential. I mean, if you look at the peacekeeping operations, it's just one example. We've seen some serious, serious problems, right, where peacekeepers are themselves engaging in human rights violations and abuses, including, victimization of women and other similar incidents that are just absolutely terrifying and unacceptable. But we don't want peacekeepers to just not violate human rights. We want every single person on the ground in those missions to be actively promoting human rights while they are there. And that initiative is still in its early phases, but it will hopefully pay big dividends over the long term. Ted, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I don't have really anything to add other than the Rights Up Front initiative came out of an exercise that the Secretary General did and the Deputy Secretary General regarding what happened in Sri Lanka during the final stages of the war there. And a number of problems emerged in the way the UN was operating on the ground in not getting humanitarian assistance to the folks that needed it, and a number of other problems in not documenting human rights abuses properly. And there was a big exercise to say, okay, what lessons have we learned from this problem, and this is what came out of it. So the UN does have some mechanisms when it's a priority to, ask itself some hard questions. Are we going to the second
Yeah, we
question
should.
as well? It's a great question. Why don't more countries run? Partly it's because, human rights are difficult, sensitive issues, and they don't want to have to make those hard decisions because they're going to piss off a neighbor or an ally, and they'd rather just avoid it. So that's one reason. You also have states that are democracies, have made tremendous progress, but are not bought into the system. So I've been doing research on 5 countries in particular: India, Brazil, South Africa, Turkey, and Indonesia. Except for Turkey, these states have sat on the Human Rights Council at various times. Brazil's done better of late, but in general, these states prefer to sit on the sidelines. They kind of put on their non-alignment hat, and they abstain, or even they vote against. And the South Africa example is another. South Africa is actually quite bad on a number of issues of human rights, even though our image of South Africa is, the rebirth after apartheid and Mandela, and they've parked that over here, and they are not mainstreaming human rights in their foreign policy. Now, because they are democracies, they do hear from their civil societies, as the Brazil and South Africa cases. So somewhat encouraged that over time it will look better than it does now. But it has been frustrating. And then finally, the workload. Year-round sessions, the UPR is very heavy. So for small states that don't have the staff to really do this, they just can't manage the workload, and they take a pass.
I would say when I came over, I was working on Israeli-Palestinian negotiations before I came to work on the UN Human Rights Council, and the biggest surprise country for me was South Africa, as far as how different their voting record in the United Nations was from my perception before I became an expert on that area of what I expected it to be. India also has an absolutely appalling record on human rights issues at the UN, opposed in principle to attention to country-specific situations. They might change their mind if there was a Pakistan resolution. We even had to fight. It took Indian civil society, Tamils, fighting the Indian government, and there were even arguments in the parliament in India prior to the Sri Lanka resolution that India eventually voted for once and then abstained the very next year on the same resolution. So just getting a democracy on the council is not in and of itself the panacea. So the domestic human rights record is only half of the equation. The other half of the equation is how does a state actually vote and behave at the UN? And that's an important consideration that we have to take into account as we recruit countries to run. But the workload and the resource issue is an enormous concern. So the old Commission on Human Rights met once a year. The Human Rights Council has 3 regular sessions and 3 UPR sessions. The regular sessions alone run for 10 weeks. Essentially, whenever the UN General Assembly isn't in its fall meetings on human rights, the Human Rights Council is doing something. And the volume is enormous. At the State Department, when the HRC goes into session in Washington, we have around 15 to 20 people who work on nothing but the HRC for those 4 or 3 weeks. We do no other work. And we will see anywhere from 20 to 35 resolutions. And we try to cover every negotiation in Geneva. Sometimes there will be 6 or 7 of those negotiations going concurrently and a debate happening on the floor. And so if you're a small delegation, you may have 1, 2, 3 diplomats. You can't be in all those places at once. How do you even make all these decisions? How do you even read all of the resolutions before they come up for an adoption, let alone make substantive, important engagement in the debates that are taking place on the floor of the council? And that's a huge question mark. Different countries have done it in different ways, and we've seen a few very small countries be incredibly successful members of the Human Rights Council. So a really great example, I think, is Sierra Leone, which fits into one of the categories of countries that I like to see coming on the HRC as a country that has itself faced tremendous human rights challenges, is in the process of overcoming them. And they bring a tremendous amount of credibility with what they say when they come to the council. And the ambassador of Sierra Leone herself had borne witness to many of the atrocities that had taken place in her own country and could speak about violence against women and children in a way that nobody else at the council could at the time. And they were an incredibly effective delegation of 3. They had interns that were at different schools in Geneva who could help them with a lot of the back office work. And there is a voluntary fund, although underfunded, to help countries that get elected to the council be able to serve. I think there needs to be more done there. And we've been engaging. The U.S. doesn't want to take the front seat here because we're a big powerhouse country. And if we fund the back offices of other countries at the HRC, then those countries are U.S. puppets. And that would be an absolute disaster for the credibility of those countries and of the council in general if it was to be viewed that way. But we've been engaging with the Swiss especially to see what can they do to provide more free office space, to provide more resources for countries to come, because Geneva is expensive. It's a tough place to be, and some of these countries are not going to be there all the time. So every UN member except for Kiribati has a mission with permanent staff in New York. In Geneva, there's 26 countries that don't have a permanent mission. And a lot of those, when you look at the list, are the kinds of countries that you would want to serve on the Human Rights Council. And so we need to find a way to be able to better help those countries to come. Because the council, being legitimate, not only needs to have a variety of different kinds of states as far as their region goes, which is mandated under how the council is structured, but it also needs to have a variety of sizes of countries, right? You can't just have the biggest 47 countries in the world sit on the Human Rights Council. If it's to look like the UN, we need small island developing states to be an important voice on the council. Right now, the Maldives is the only one of those countries sitting on the council. When it was elected, it was exactly the kind of country we wanted to see on the HRC, an emerging democracy that had overcome a pretty rough period. Unfortunately, now their previous president is living under house arrest. Their situation is backsliding tremendously, and their votes are also backsliding concurrently pretty badly at the Human Rights Council at the same time. But the biggest disappointment to me in the last Human Rights Council election was the Bahamas lost. They came in very, very late, with only 3 months left before the vote in New York, and still managed to get 115 votes for their candidacy to the Human Rights Council. But they would have been the first English-speaking country from the Latin American and Caribbean group to ever be elected to the Human Rights Council. Every single country that sat on the HRC from that region is a Spanish-speaking country except for Brazil. And the only Caribbean country to ever be elected to the council is Cuba. And that's a really big problem. those smaller island states need to have a seat at the table. The Pacific Island states, none of them have ever been on the Human Rights Council. Many of those countries are actually progressive democratic states where the human rights of their citizens are pretty well protected. And those countries can bring a unique and different voice to the table as well. And they're also some of the most recently decolonized countries. And so that's a different kind of experience that they can bring to the table as well. But it's just really tough for some of those. It's hard for the US to keep up with the workload of the council. And we have the second largest delegation at the HRC and probably the largest back office operation. Actually, I'm sure we have the largest back office operation because the State Department is the largest foreign ministry in the world. With our legal advisor's office alone is probably larger than the foreign ministries of most countries. And so they can't engage in the same way, and it's a huge task to sign up for. And we're very cognizant of that as we ask countries to join and to serve. But I think the record shows that when small countries that care about human rights come on, they can be really effective. Montenegro and Macedonia have been really outspoken, important members of the Human Rights Council, tiny, tiny little countries. We're very excited to see Mongolia come onto the council this year. Tunisia is a candidate running for election the same year as us to come on hopefully next year, which would be another great example of a country that has exited dictatorship, embraced democracy. That's the kind of storyline that we really want to see coming onto the council wherever possible. But it's an enormous ask. We asked Tunisia to run 2 years ago, and it's taken them 3 years to build up the capacity and to prepare to sit on this body for just 3 years. And not every country is willing to sign up to do that. And of course, many of the ones that do will serve for the 3 years and they're exhausted and they don't run for a second term. And it can be a decade or more before we would see them run for another term for the council. And I don't have a really good answer for how to fix that, but I think that we certainly are trying to work very closely with the Swiss and also through our DRL Bureau, the Democracy, Human Rights, and Labor Bureau, which can work to help build up the capacity of civil society in these countries that run. Because one way that a small delegation can also be more effective at the HRC is to know, I can't be in the room for every one of these negotiations, but I can hear from my own civil society about how I should vote. And even that, I think, is an important thing. And so building up the capacity of civil society in developing countries as well to be able to play a positive role vis-a-vis their delegation in Geneva is going to be an important step to help empower in the future, too.
Thank you. Thank you both. I think that this has been a great evening so far, and we have refreshments in the back. But before I let everyone out and go to that, I love closing meetings with action items, so I would love to close this discussion with a challenge for the audience. Like, what is something that we can take away and go back and do that is related to the things that we were talking about here tonight?
Well, I mean, I think I pointed out a couple of them. I would just say that we should continue to remind all those that have a voice in making the decision, including Congress, that the United States needs to stay engaged as a leader on human rights at the United Nations and to back it up with the resources to make it work.
I would only second that very same challenge, that really you are pushing on an open door at the State Department. We understand how important it is for us to be there. But we continue to face tremendous criticism and challenge from Congress to get the resources that we need to be able to engage. And we really need the conversation with the Hill to move beyond whether or not the U.S. should be at the Human Rights Council to what more can the U.S. do at the HRC and at the UN for the protection and promotion of human rights. And the only way we're going to hear that is when Congress is hearing from their constituents. Thanks.
So there you have it, a challenge to end the evening with, to go back and to talk to your friends about as well. Thank you both so much for coming tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panel and Heather for organizing this event. Christine, a wonderful event by the Human Rights. And thank you to the American Foreign Service Association. They're wonderful partners to UNA-NCA. What depth of experience and wisdom in that organization, and we look forward to opportunities to engage foreign service officers and former foreign service officers in the many programs we have to learn from them and to learn from each other. So thank you for hosting this wonderful event. And it's a wonderful challenge. We've got a group going up to visit the senators and delegates from Virginia in this week and next week. So they can take your challenge at heart and make sure that we continue to work for a strong human rights program and good U.S. leadership at the United Nations. So thank you very much.